Have you ever watched a predator play with its food, only to realize the food has teeth? What happens when a billionaire tries to humiliate a tired waitress in front of the world's elite, only to accidentally awaken a sleeping prodigy? Grab your popcorn, because arrogance is about to get a standing ovation. The Atlantic Ocean lashed against the jagged cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, but inside the sprawling cliffside estate of Richard Harrington, the only sounds were the soft clinking of baccarat crystal and the low murmuring hum of extreme wealth. The mansion was a monument to new money trying desperately to look old. Marble floors imported from Italy, vaulted ceilings painted with Renaissance-style frescoes, and a guest list that read like the Forbes 500 directory. Moving invisibly through this sea of silk and bespoke tuxedos was Claire Mitchell. Claire was 24, running on 3 hours of sleep and wearing a stiff, ill-fitting black catering uniform that chafed against her collarbone. Her feet, encased in sensible rubber-soled shoes, screamed in silent agony. She was a server for Elite Gastronomy, the premier catering service for the East Coast's 1%. Her job tonight was simple: keep the Veuve Clicquot flowing remain entirely invisible, and do not, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the guests. For the past 4 years, invisibility had been Claire's superpower. It was a defense mechanism she had cultivated ever since her father's pancreatic cancer diagnosis had swallowed her family's finances whole, forcing her to drop out of the Juilliard School's pre-college division. The grand pianos, the grueling 6-hour practice sessions, the applause, all of it had been traded for medical bills, collection agencies, and the heavy silver-plated trays she now balanced for 14 hours a day. In the center of the grand ballroom stood the man of the hour, Richard Harrington. Richard was a tech magnate turned real estate mogul who had made his fortune by buying struggling companies, stripping them of their assets, and leaving the employees jobless. He was 39, ruthlessly handsome, and possessed the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from never being told no. Tonight was his birthday, an extravagant charity gala designed entirely to massage his ego. He stood near the center of the room, holding court with a group of sycophants. Among them was Arthur Pendleton, the legendary silver-haired director of the New York Philharmonic, who looked supremely bored, and Victoria Kensington, a prominent socialite, who looked at the waitstaff as if they were a mild infestation of termites. The problem with modern art, Arthur Haustent. Richard was saying, loudly waving a hand that sported a watch worth more than Claire's childhood home, is that it lacks discipline. It lacks the ruthless edge of commerce. Claire approached the circle, her silver tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips, bearing 6 flutes of champagne. She waited for a lull in the conversation, the trained, invisible servant, looking for the right moment to offer a fresh glass. Suddenly, Richard laughed at his own joke, taking a sharp, unexpected step backward while throwing his arms wide. The collision was inevitable. Richard's elbow slammed into Claire's tray. Time seemed to slow down. Claire tried to correct the balance, her wrists snapping into a rigid, desperate angle. But physics was unforgiving. The tray tipped. 3 delicate crystal flutes toppled, sending a cascade of icy golden champagne directly down the back of Richard Harrington's custom-tailored midnight blue Brioni jacket. The sound of shattering glass on the marble floor cut through the ballroom like a gunshot. The string quartet in the corner faltered and stopped. The low hum of conversation evaporated. 400 pairs of eyes snapped toward the center of the room. Claire froze the empty tray, still hovering in her hands. The air was sucked out of her lungs. "Sir, I am so incredibly sorry," she gasped, her voice trembling but clear. "I will get a towel immediately." Richard turned around slowly. The jovial, arrogant mask had vanished, replaced by a gaze so cold it could have frozen the ocean outside. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his jacket, then up at Claire. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her uniform, sizing up her insignificance. "You're sorry," Richard repeated softly. The quietness of his voice was terrifying. In the world of the ultra-rich, the louder a man yells, the less power he has. Richard didn't need to yell. Susan, the head of the catering company, materialized out of nowhere, her face pale with sheer terror. "Mr. Harrington, my deepest apologies. She is new. I will have her removed from the premises immediately. And we will, of course, cover the cost of the garment. Remove her." Richard mused, dabbing at his sleeve with a linen napkin offered by Victoria, who was sneering openly at Claire. "Susan, this jacket is vicuña wool. It costs $25,000. Firing a girl who likely sleeps in a room smaller than my closet doesn't replace my jacket. It doesn't fix the fact that she has embarrassed me in front of my guests." He stepped closer to Claire. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed sickeningly with the spilled alcohol. "What is your name, clumsy?" "Claire," she said, keeping her chin level. She refused to look at the floor. She had lost her father, her dreams, and her youth. She was not going to let this corporate vampire take her dignity. Richard noticed the defiant spark in her eyes, and a cruel, amused smile touched the corner of his lips. He hated defiance. He lived to crush it. He glanced around the room, letting the silence stretch, savoring his absolute power over the situation. His eyes landed on the raised dais at the back of the room. Resting upon it was a magnificent 9-foot Steinway Model D concert, grand piano gleaming under the chandelier. The hired pianist had taken a break during the string quartet's set. "I don't want you fired, Claire," Richard announced, his voice projecting so the entire room could hear. "I believe in working off one's debts. You've ruined the mood of my party, so you're going to fix it." He pointed a manicured finger toward the dais. "Go up there and entertain my guests. Play us a song." A smattering of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Susan looked horrified. "Mr. Harrington, please, she's just a server. I can—" "Quiet, Susan, or your company will never cater in this state again," Richard snapped without looking at her. He turned back to Claire, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Go on, Claire. You have an audience. Play us something beautiful. Or if you can't, you can stand up there in your stained uniform and publicly apologize to every person in this room, and then I will sue you for the cost of the suit. Your choice." It was a perfectly constructed trap, a public humiliation designed to break her spirit for the amusement of his bored, wealthy friends. Victoria Kensington let out a soft, mocking giggle. Claire looked at the Steinway. It had been 6 years since she had sat behind a piano of that caliber. 6 years since she had laid her hands on the ivory keys. The calluses on her fingers had long faded, replaced by burns from hot plates and cuts from kitchen knives. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Well," Richard taunted, crossing his arms, "we're waiting." Claire handed her empty serving tray to a stunned Susan. She didn't say a word to Richard. She simply turned and began to walk across the marble floor toward the dais. The walk to the piano felt like a march to the gallows. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the squeak of Claire's rubber-soled shoes against the marble. The guests parted for her like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of pity, amusement, and cruel curiosity. "Look at her," she heard a woman whisper behind a feathered fan. "She looks absolutely terrified. Richard is terribly wicked, but you have to admit, this is entertaining." Claire climbed the 2 velvet-carpeted steps onto the dais. The Steinway Model D sat before her like a sleeping beast. It was flawless, polished to a mirror, shine its lid propped open to project sound into the cavernous room. She sat down on the leather bench. It was a fraction of an inch too low, but she didn't adjust it. She couldn't afford to show weakness. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. Her nails were trimmed short, unpainted. There was a small bandage on her left index finger from chopping garnishes an hour ago. From the center of the room, Richard raised his glass of scotch in a mocking toast. "Any time today, Claire, try not to break the keys, they're ivory." Laughter echoed through the room. Claire closed her eyes. The ballroom, the mocking laughter, the smell of spilled champagne, the aching in her arches, she forced it all away. She imagined a heavy soundproof door closing in her mind, locking out the present. She reached back through the years past, the hospitals, past the grief, past the endless shifts, and the smell of industrial dish soap. She found the girl who used to practice until her fingers bled. She found the prodigy. She opened her eyes. She raised her hands and let them hover over the keys. She didn't choose a simple pop song or a basic jazz standard. If Richard Harrington wanted a performance, she was going to give him a reckoning. Claire's hands descended. Crash. The opening chord of Frédéric Chopin's ballad. Number 1 in G minor exploded from the Steinway. It wasn't just loud, it was violently passionate, a towering, majestic dissonance that struck the room like a physical blow. In the center of the room, Richard Harrington flinched instinctively, taking a step back. Several guests gasped. Claire didn't pause. The heavy, dramatic introduction melted instantly into the melancholic, haunting first theme. Her fingers, though out of practice, possessed a muscle memory forged in fire. They flew across the keys with devastating precision. The music wept, it pleaded, it whispered of profound grief and unspoken rage. The acoustics of the ballroom, designed to amplify sound, caught the music and hurled it into every corner. It was impossible to ignore. It demanded absolute surrender. At the edge of the crowd, Arthur Pendleton, the legendary Philharmonic director, had been holding a martini halfway to his mouth. When the first chord struck his arm, froze. As Claire transitioned into the intricate, demanding arpeggios, Arthur slowly lowered his glass to a passing waiter's tray without looking. His eyes, suddenly sharp and intensely focused, were locked onto the girl in the cheap black uniform. Impossible, Arthur thought, taking a slow step forward. The phrasing, the rubato, that isn't amateur playing. That is world-class virtuosity. Claire was no longer in Newport. She was in a void of her own making. The anger at Richard, the grief for her father, the exhaustion of her daily life. She poured every ounce of her soul into the instrument. The tempo accelerated. The piece demanded frantic leaping octaves and rapid sweeping scales that required the strength of an athlete and the delicate touch of a surgeon. She executed them flawlessly. The crowd was paralyzed. The cruel smirks had been wiped completely from their faces. Victoria Kensington's mouth was slightly open, her mocking demeanor shattered by the sheer, undeniable force of the talent unfolding before her. The guests weren't just listening. They were bearing witness to an exorcism. Claire's body swayed with the music, her dark hair falling out of its neat professional bun to frame her face. She looked fierce, almost feral, commanding the massive instrument with absolute authority. Richard Harrington stood frozen. His jaw was tight. He looked around the room, realizing with a sickening drop in his stomach that the dynamic had shifted completely. He had intended to display a peasant for the amusement of his court. Instead, he had given a queen her throne. The guests weren't looking at Claire with pity. They were looking at her with a profound, breathless reverence. They had forgotten Richard entirely. The piece reached its chaotic, furious climax, the presto con fuoco. It is a section so notoriously difficult that it breaks seasoned professionals. Claire attacked it relentlessly. Her hands were blurs of motion, striking the keys with a thunderous power that shook the floorboards. The music was a storm, a raging tempest of sound that seemed impossible to be coming from the slender, overworked girl on the bench. With a final devastating series of cascading octaves, Claire struck the ending chords. Bam! 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 She lifted her foot from the pedal. The immense sound reverberated through the vast ballroom, slowly decaying against the marble walls, until there was nothing left but a suffocating, electrifying silence. Claire kept her head bowed for a long moment, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling beneath the cheap fabric of her uniform. Her hands rested gently on her lap. For 10 excruciating seconds, nobody moved. The silence was heavier than the music had been. Then, near the front of the crowd, an older man with silver hair stepped forward. Arthur Pendleton. He raised his hands, bringing them together in a slow, sharp clap. Clap, clap, clap. Suddenly the spell broke. As if a dam had burst, the entire ballroom erupted. It didn't start with polite high society applause. It was a roaring, thunderous ovation. Men in tuxedos were cheering. Women in designer gowns were clapping wildly. Susan, the catering manager, was leaning against a pillar, crying silently. Claire slowly turned her head and looked directly at Richard Harrington. The billionaire stood amidst the roaring crowd. His vicuña jacket still stained his face, pale, utterly diminished. He had tried to break her. But as the applause deafened the room, Claire Mitchell stood up from the bench, smoothed down her apron, and gave Richard a cold, microscopic bow. She hadn't just entertained them. She had conquered them. The roaring applause in the grand ballroom felt like a physical weight pressing against Richard Harrington. His face, usually a mask of smug invulnerability, had mottled into an ugly, bruised purple. He had expected to see a broken, weeping girl apologizing on her knees. Instead, he was standing in the shadow of a giant. Before Richard could formulate a single word of retaliation, Arthur Pendleton, the silver-haired titan of the New York Philharmonic, was already moving. He pushed past a stunned Victoria Kensington and strode directly to the dais. Arthur did not look at Richard. He didn't look at the spilled champagne or the shattered crystal. His piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on Claire. The phrasing in the coda. Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. That heavy dragging rubato on the descending scales. I have only ever heard one person play Chopin with that specific, tragic articulation, and he passed away 3 years ago. Claire's breath hitched. She wiped a sheen of sweat from her forehead, her hands still vibrating with adrenaline. Leon Fleischer. Arthur breathed, speaking the name of the legendary real-world pianist and pedagogue with immense reverence. You were his student. You have to be. A heavy lump formed in Claire's throat. She hadn't heard her mentor's name spoken aloud since the funeral. She whispered, I was his final private pupil at the Peabody Institute before my father got sick. Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Good God! The Van Cliburn Foundation was practically tearing the country apart, looking for you when you vanished off the roster 4 years ago. You were the prodigy who withdrew a week before the preliminaries. Claire Mitchell. The guests closest to the dais murmured in shock, the whispers rippling outward. A prodigy. Leon Fleischer's student. The elite crowd, always hungry for proximity to true historic greatness, looked at Claire with newfound obsession. Enough! The word cracked like a whip. Richard Harrington shoved his way to the front of the crowd, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to fracture. He could not stand it. This was his birthday. This was his house. This girl was a server, a nobody earning minimum wage who had ruined his $25,000 vicuña jacket. And now his own guests, the people whose adoration he had purchased with caviar and expensive scotch, were treating her like royalty. This is a catering shift, not a recital at Carnegie Hall. Richard spat, glaring at Arthur. Step away from the piano, Arthur. And you? He turned his venomous gaze to Claire. Get out of my house. You're fired. I am calling the police to press charges for the destruction of my property. The room went dead silent. The cruelty of the statement was so jarring, so completely devoid of grace, that even Richard's most loyal sycophants looked uncomfortable. Richard, don't be absurd, Victoria Kensington piped up, surprising everyone. She fanned herself nervously. The girl has a gift. It was an accident. I don't care what she has, Richard roared, finally losing his iron grip on his temper. She humiliated me. She is a clumsy waitress who got lucky with a memorized parlor trick. Anyone can bash their hands against the keys if they practice one song long enough. Arthur Pendleton straightened his posture, turning to face the billionaire. Richard, you are demonstrating a profound, embarrassing ignorance. What she just played requires a level of mastery you couldn't purchase with your entire net worth. Is that right? Richard sneered. His eyes darted around the room, reading the faces of his peers. They were judging him. They thought he was small, a petty tyrant. His massive ego demanded he crush this girl, utterly proving, once and for all, that money was the only real power in the room. Richard reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook. He unclipped a heavy Montblanc pen from his lapel. A parlor trick. Richard repeated his voice, dropping back to a dangerous, icy calm. Let's test that theory, maestro. You think she's a genius? Let's see how she handles pressure. He scribbled violently on the check, tore it from the binding, and slammed it down onto the polished mahogany lid of the Steinway. The sum, written in bold black ink, was staggering $250,000. Claire stared at the paper. $250,000. It was the exact amount of the medical debt that had been suffocating her family, the debt that had driven her mother to work 2 jobs and forced Claire into this humiliating uniform. It was her freedom. $250,000, Richard announced to the room. If you are truly a master, Claire, then play something impossible. Play Franz Liszt's La Campanella, and you will play it flawlessly. If you miss a single note, if you falter for even a fraction of a second, you walk out of here with nothing. I sue your catering company into bankruptcy, and you spend the rest of your pathetic life paying for my suit. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. La Campanella, the Little Bell. It was notoriously one of the most difficult pieces in the entire piano repertoire, requiring agonizingly fast right-hand jumps, spanning massive intervals at breakneck speed. It was a piece that terrified seasoned concert pianists. To demand a waitress play it perfectly on command under immense psychological pressure was sadistic. Arthur's face flushed with anger. You are out of your mind, Harrington. You can't ask a musician who hasn't practiced in years to— I accept, Claire said. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the tension like a scalpel. She looked at Richard, her dark eyes devoid of fear. The anger inside her had burned away, leaving only a cold, diamond-hard focus. Claire slowly sat back down on the leather bench. She didn't look at the check resting on the piano lid. She didn't look at Arthur, who was staring at her with breathless anxiety. She certainly didn't look at Richard Harrington. She stared at the keys. La Campanella is unforgiving. It mimics the high, rapid ringing of a handbell. It requires the pianist's right hand to leap across the keyboard with a terrifying, inhuman velocity, striking high staccato notes, while the left hand maintains a furious driving melody. If she hesitated for a microsecond, the illusion would shatter. Claire took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of expensive lilies and spilled champagne. She remembered her father's voice, raspy from chemotherapy, telling her, "Never let them see you sweat, kiddo. You own the instrument. It doesn't own you." She raised her right hand. Ting. The first high D sharp rang out, crystal clear and impossibly delicate. It hung in the air, sweet and innocent. Ting, ting. And then the madness began. Claire's hands became a blur. The right hand began its punishing leaps, jumping back and forth across octaves with a speed that defied the eye. The notes cascaded from the Steinway, bright, frantic, and flawlessly precise. It didn't sound like a piano anymore. It sounded like 1,000 silver bells ringing in a frantic, joyous storm. The ballroom was entirely petrified. The guests weren't just listening. They were watching a high-wire act without a net. The physical exertion required was immense. Sweat beaded on Claire's forehead, but her face remained a mask of pure, unadulterated concentration. Richard Harrington's smug expression began to dissolve. He watched her hands, waiting for the slip, waiting for the missed note that would secure his victory. But the slip never came. As the piece progressed, the technical demands grew astronomical. The trills, the rapid repeated notes, the thundering chromatic scales, Claire executed them with a terrifying, almost aggressive perfection. She wasn't just surviving the piece. She was attacking it, bending Liszt's impossible demands to her will. Arthur Pendleton gripped the edge of the dais, his knuckles white. Tears were openly streaming down his face. He was watching the resurrection of a brilliant career, a lotus flower blooming from the mud of a Newport catering shift. The final section of La Campanella is a brilliant, explosive sprint to the finish. Claire poured every ounce of her remaining strength into the keys. Her arms ached, her uncalloused fingers screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain driven by the memory of every agonizing shift, every unpaid bill, every sneer from people like Richard Harrington. With a blinding flurry of devastating octaves, she struck the final chord. The grand ballroom exploded. It wasn't an ovation, it was a riot. Men were shouting, women were openly weeping. Arthur Pendleton bypassed the velvet steps, entirely vaulting onto the dais, and pulling Claire into a massive, desperate embrace. "Magnificent!" Arthur shouted over the deafening roar of the crowd. "Absolutely magnificent! You are coming with me tomorrow. The Juilliard faculty will weep when they hear this." Claire pulled back, exhausted, gasping for air, a radiant, triumphant smile breaking across her face for the first time in years. She turned to look at Richard Harrington. The billionaire was standing alone. His friends had abandoned him, rushing forward to try and get closer to Claire. He looked small. He looked utterly, completely defeated. The check for $250,000 still sat on the piano lid. Claire walked over, picked up the piece of paper, and examined it. The ink was dry. The signature was valid. She stepped down from the dais and walked over to Richard. The crowd parted for her, their eyes filled with awe. She stopped inches from him. "A parlor trick," Claire said softly, repeating his words. She reached behind her back and untied the strings of her black catering apron. She pulled it over her head. With a swift, deliberate motion, she dropped the cheap-stained apron directly onto Richard Harrington's immaculate leather shoes. "Keep it, Richard," Claire said, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly quieted circle. "You wear the stains much better than I do." Without waiting for a response, Claire Mitchell turned her back on the billionaire. She walked across the Italian marble floor, clutching her freedom in her right hand, and pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cool, salty air of the Atlantic, leaving the glass castle and its shattered king entirely behind her. If Claire's triumphant payback gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories of underdogs taking back their power. Have you ever turned the tables on a bully? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that true talent can never be silenced.